You are indeed watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side Live. I'm one of your hosts, Eugene Perrier, here, as always, truly alongside, in fact, my intrepid co-host, Rania Kalik. Rania, good to be with you.
Good to be with you, Eugene. And today we're actually sitting like a few feet away from each other.
I could look at you, but it would be weird because I would be looking off camera. So, I mean, I'm looking at you now.
I know. I just looked at you now. That's how close he is to me, you guys. I'm looking at Eugene right now, right in front of me.
Yeah, well, listen, it's the movie magic, electric light company. What's the one that was behind Star Wars? I don't know. It doesn't matter. Long story short, here we are. We're back. This is the Freedom Side. We have a great show coming up for you today. As always, swinging around the world, Palestine, Europe, right here in the United States, Mississippi. Amazing legislative coup happening there in the capital of Jackson. Should be interesting for you. 50th anniversary of Wounded Knee, junk fees in prison. So as always, for those of you watching on YouTube, make sure you hit subscribe, hit the bell so that you can get the alerts, but also make sure that you let everyone who is following you in any way, shape, or form follow us, which you could do through any range of things. You could text someone, you could yell out the window. You really can't mail them anything at this point, but at the very least, you could maybe tweet something out, put it on Instagram or whatever it may be. But I think that they would be very grateful to you. And while we're telling them to subscribe, hit the bell, and inform their followers, Rania, what else should those watching know that they can do here?
Well, Eugene, they can go to patreon.com/breakthrough news and become patrons of the show. Unfortunately, we did not meet our goal in the month of February to get you to join Instagram. We were so close. We were just a couple away. So
thank you to everyone who donated and everyone who decided not to at the last second.
Don't listen to him. Do not listen to him. So listen, here's the deal. For those who don't know what I'm talking about, I'm going to explain it. For those who do, listen to it again. Month of March. If we can get, should we say 100, Eugene?
Sure. Same goal.
If we can get 100 new patrons in the month of March, Eugene will join Instagram. So those of you who tried to sabotage me last time, you suck. For those of you who want to see Eugene on Instagram as I do, become a patron at patreon.com/breakthrough news.
Thank you to those who privately messaged me about how you were considering becoming patrons, and I asked you, please wait till March 1. Appreciate that assistance.
Nice try.
Okay, well, listen, but in all seriousness, please, patreon.com/breakthrough news, subscribe, hit the bell, get the alerts. Super happy to have you with us. And now we want to turn to our first story. Just terrible situation in Palestine. Brutal attacks on Palestinians. Maybe that's par for the course, but still brutal and outrageous. And as always, we are honored to be joined here by Ali Abu Nima, who's the director of Electronic Intifada, also the author of The Battle for Justice in Palestine. Ali, thank you so much for being back with us.
Thank you, Eugene.
Well, I was hoping we could just start. Maybe you could give folks some context to this. I'm always hesitant to call it an escalation, but let's just call it significant outpouring of violence against Palestinians that we've seen over the past week or so.
Yeah, it's hard to find the right term because if we say escalation or outbreak, it makes it seem as if normally there isn't violence. And I think the reality that we have to try to convey to people is that the violence is relentless. Israeli military occupation, Israeli settler colonialism, Israeli apartheid is 24/7, 365 violence against every Palestinian man, woman, and child everywhere all the time. They're never free from the violence. What we've seen since the beginning of the year is Israel has escalated its raids into Palestinian cities and refugee camps. It's killed almost 70 Palestinians since the start of the year, and many of them in these massive daytime raids that have happened in cities like Jenin and Nablus. For example, in Nablus on February 22nd, a massive Israeli army force went into the very densely populated old city of Nablus in broad daylight, guns blazing, firing indiscriminately, and killing a dozen Palestinians and injuring 100 more. This has been happening all over the place. And so, quite predictably and inevitably, there has been an upsurge in Palestinian resistance. This year, so far, 13 Israelis have been killed in the context of violence. 7 of them were killed in a single shooting attack that came again in response to one of these massive Israeli raids on a Palestinian community in which multiple people were killed. So it's a cliche to talk about a spiral of violence or a cycle of violence because that erases the responsibility. But we can talk about a spiral of escalation. I don't know if that metaphor even works, but there is sort of a violence escalator. At the root of it is the violence of the Israeli occupation and settler colonial invasion of Palestinian land. That's what's driving it. And what we saw
Ali,
in those, sorry.
No, please. I didn't want to interrupt you. Go ahead. I thought you were. Well, I wanted to ask you. This is fun. You go ahead and then I'll go ahead. Let's do that.
Well, I just wanted to say that that's sort of the broad context for what we saw in that brief clip, which is the settler pogrom in the village of Huwara, where 2 settlers were killed a week ago on Sunday. 2 settlers were killed in Huwara village, and then the Israeli army allowed hordes of settlers to pour into the town, ransacking businesses, setting fire to homes, killing 1 Palestinian, and taking their revenge. And all of this, it's important to note because these images were so shocking to people around the world that Israeli leaders started to say, "Oh, we'll have to put a stop to this sort of thing. This isn't what we intended." It is what they intended, because prior to this pogrom and during the pogrom, top Israeli leaders were inciting it, praising it, saying that we want to see Huwara burned, we want to see the village destroyed. Bezalel Smotrich, the Israeli finance minister, on the same Sunday when the 2 settlers were killed, said Israel should go mad on the Palestinians and start attacking Palestinian cities with tanks and helicopters. So the settlers were simply doing the bidding of the Israeli state.
And I'm glad that you raised that, because the response from the US and the EU has been very much to try to condemn both sides, but in interestingly different ways. I actually want to show a clip of Ned Price being asked about this, if we could bring that up, and I'd like to get your reaction to it. Just waiting for the clip. Sorry, guys.
Yes.
Hi. I noticed in your tweet yesterday you referred to the shooting in which 2 Israelis were killed as a terror attack or terrorism, whereas the settler violence was separated. Was that deliberate? And if yes, how do you differentiate or decide when to use the word terrorism versus when not to?
I think it's best not to parse and to go into definitions from the podium. We are condemning the extremist violence that we've seen over the past couple days. We issued a very strong condemnation of the killing of the Israelis that we've seen over the weekend. We've issued today a very strong condemnation of the violence that's resulted in the death of Palestinian and the destruction of property. In all of these cases, in all cases of extremist violence, we think it's important that there be accountability, that there be justice, equal justice under the law.
So, Ali, I mean, that's, to me, what I see there is Israeli settlers committing acts of violence. Committing a pogrom is just violence, and it's bad, but it's violence. Whereas Palestinians who live in the West Bank attacking settlers is terrorism. What do you have to say to that?
Yes, that's consistent. It's Israelis can't do terrorism. Only Palestinians can. According to both the United States and the European Union, because the European Union, being the lapdogs of the United States, copy exactly what the Americans say and do. And so the EU position has been identical. But listen to what Ned Price said. He said, equal justice under the law. What law is he talking about? First of all, we're in occupied territory. Where Israel is the military occupier. And under the Israeli military occupation, there is no equal justice under the law. Palestinians live under Israeli military rule and military orders, whereas the Israeli settlers live under Israeli civil law. So right there on paper, you have a separate and unequal system. You have an apartheid system. If you're an Israeli settler, you're not subject to military law. You're subject to the Israeli civil system. If you're a Palestinian, you're subject to Israeli military law. But if you're a Palestinian, you don't get as far as the law. If you pick up a stone, you'll just be shot dead. Whereas the settlers are treated with kid gloves. In fact, they're protected by the army while they are busy attacking Palestinians. And that's not just in Huwara, that's all the time. In fact, for example, you could go to the website of B'Tselem, an Israeli human rights group, or their YouTube channel. They have tons of videos going back years documenting Israeli settlers attacking Palestinians, attacking and killing Palestinian livestock, burning their property, destroying their trees, while the soldiers are watching and just, protecting the settlers while they do this job of vandalizing Palestinian property and making Palestinian life hell on behalf of the Israeli state. The settlers are the fist of the Israeli state, of Israeli land theft and settler colonization. And that is absent from the language of the State Department. And when he talks about equal justice under the law, who's going to bring this equal justice? The military occupier? I mean, we're coming up, I can't believe how fast we're coming up. It will be on May the 11th, the first anniversary of the cold-blooded murder on live television of Shireen Abu Akleh, a US citizen and the correspondent of Al Jazeera. Has there been justice for Shireen Abu Akleh? On the contrary, the United States government helped Israel cover up her deliberate murder. And this has been the policy of the Biden administration, of the Democratic Party, that the more extreme, the more violent, the more fanatical Israel shows itself to be, the more the Democrats do to cover it up. The more that Joe Biden does and Antony Blinken do to cover it up and to try to blame Palestinians for it and tell Palestinians, you guys, you need to calm down. You need to calm down and restore calm. While they're shipping every weapon in the American stockpile to Ukraine so Ukrainians can fight back against Russia, they're telling Palestinians, you just need to calm down and take it. And if you lift so much as a rock in the face of your invaders and your occupiers, then you're a terrorist, and they have the right to shoot you dead. This is the reality. It's a reality that I don't think any people in the world would accept. But Palestinians are told, just calm down and accept it. And if you're good, if you behave well, maybe we'll give you a couple of $1 million more for health clinics in refugee camps where you're going to live forever, by the way, because we're never going to support justice for you so that you can go back to your homes.
Mm. No, it's no lies detected. I mean, I for sure. I mean, it's unbelievable, almost like the fairy tale nature of some of this, the way it's, I remember doing the Great March of Return, people are peacefully marching, getting sniped down. And then when Israel's being criticized, it's like, well, there's terror kites being flown. And it's just so absurd that you would think like this is so laughable, but it's allowed to play out in the media. And certainly if you want to comment on that, I'm happy to hear. But one thing I want to also ask your thoughts on, Ali, is it seems that the resistance in Palestine, especially amongst young people, is also strengthening majorly. majorly. I mean, I'm seeing all these videos of these night marches of people coming out, the calls from Lion's Den from people to resist. Now I see the PA trying to catch up at the last second and say they're going to do something too. So I wonder how you also evaluate, what seems to me to be almost a generational changing of the guard here of Palestinians really coming out in a powerful way.
I think, let's step back and look at the big picture, because the particulars of what's been happening now can only be understood against the bigger picture. Since Israel was established by force and illegitimately over the ruins of hundreds of Palestinian towns and villages, Israel has tried to subdue the indigenous Palestinian population with every violent method. Regular massacres, which we've seen throughout the West Bank, in Gaza, even of Palestinians within so-called Israel, punitive home demolitions, revenge demolitions, a tactic which is reserved for Palestinians. Israel will never demolish the family home of a Jew who murders a Palestinian. That punishment is reserved only for the families of Palestinians, collective punishment. A very savage method, always used by colonial regimes, is if we make the natives suffer enough, eventually they will accept their subordinate position and stop resisting. So murder, imprisonment, torture, home demolitions, aerial bombing, anything, Israel has done it. And 75 years after the Nakba, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, the Palestinian people are not subdued. And remember, the Israeli justification for these murderous raids in Jenin, in Nablus, in Hebron, wherever it is, this is to thwart terrorist attacks. Well, the very next day, Palestinian resistance groups can carry out sophisticated operations against Israel. And an even more common phenomenon is these individual actions by Palestinians, Palestinians picking up a knife or picking up a gun and going to get, going to retaliate, or you could say get revenge. Israel cannot stop it. In fact, everything Israel does fuels it. And so what we see is a frustration in the settler state that, look, we've done everything to these people and they're still fighting back. So it's a constant escalation of Israeli terror, of Israeli collective punishment, with the aim of subjugating this people who refuse to be subjugated. So when you look at this young generation, they're undeterred. They are undeterred, but they also have no choice because, people are already living in refugee camps like Aqbat Jabir or Arub or the camps across the West Bank, which Israel is raiding, Sha'afat camp. The Palestinians, okay, we're already in refugee camps. What do you want from us? No, they're still sending in the army and attacking people in refugee camps and killing them and carrying out extrajudicial executions. So it's not as if people have a choice but to fight back and defend themselves. That's what Palestinians are doing. They have a right to fight back. They have a right to defend themselves. And who are all these people in the West to quibble with them? People who are okay with Israel using anti-tank missiles in the middle of the old city of Nablus. People who are okay with Israel using high-powered sniper rifles against children at the Great March of Return. And they're quibbling with the Palestinians throwing stones? Are you kidding me? Then send the Palestinians precision-guided missiles so that they can take out the Israeli military bases and the military command posts where these attacks against them are being planned. But Palestinians are left alone against a merciless nuclear-armed enemy, and then they're being lectured from the West, oh, you mustn't do this, you mustn't do that. Palestinians won't take those lectures from people, and they will fight back with the means they have. And the escalation is coming only from the occupier and the invader. This conflict would be over Tomorrow, if Israel were to respect the rights of Palestinians, were to respect international law, and were to respect the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people. But the reality is this: if Palestinians stop resisting, they will be wiped out. If Israel stops attacking them, there will be peace.
Well, Ali, that is very true. And I appreciate you, as always, being willing to join us and help us sort through all of this. And I hope everyone is following the Electronic Intifada, which I think is necessary reading. But thanks again for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.
Well, it's always the same story.
It is. But as they say, oppression breeds resistance. So, I mean, it's not good news, but certainly the flame of resistance still alive there in Palestine. Well, we're going to shift gears here now to the European continent. I kind of want to start calling Europe a subcontinent, but that's a whole separate conversation that I would have. But the continent of Europe that over the past weekend saw a number of demonstrations all around major European capitals for peace in Ukraine and calling for a swift end to the conflict that we're seeing between Ukraine and Russia. So we are very, very honored to be joined once again here by Ben Chaco, who's a journalist and the editor of the Morning Star. Ben, thanks so much for being back with us.
Oh, thanks for inviting me.
Well, great to have you. And over the past weekend, Berlin, London, I think Brussels as well, all over Italy, there were large and in some cases very significant demonstrations demanding peace on the European continent. Now, this seems to be, I'm curious your thought about this, kind of maybe the first big outbreak of this kind of conversation, at least coming from, more progressive and left-leaning forces. So what do you think it means to have seen this coordinated day of action across the continent?
Well, I think obviously the timing is connected to the fact that we've just had the first anniversary of the war beginning. But I think that Europeans are waking up to just how damaging this whole conflict is for the whole of Europe. That in Germany, we had the biggest protest of all, I think, the 50,000 people at the Brandenburg Gate saying we need negotiations and to stop arming Ukraine. But they see that they are being dragged into a proxy war by NATO against Russia to weaken Russia. And the cost of this war for ordinary people in Europe is actually quite staggering. We're seeing it in the disruption of trade, which has led oil and gas prices in Europe to rise to absolutely shocking levels. In Britain, we're talking about people spending 10% of their income now on heating their homes. This is a really rapid rise, in the cost of energy, and it's doubled in 1 year in Britain. And if you were to go back a couple of years before that, it's doubled from that again. And we've seen that in Germany as well because of the huge role that, Russian supplies of oil and gas did play in Europe, but simply because of the effect on the international markets as well. So that's created an inflationary crisis. At the same time, certainly in Britain, we've had, 13 years of cuts in public spending. We've had a devastating pandemic where the weaknesses of our public services were all exposed. And yet now the government is saying we need to spend more billions on arming Ukraine. We don't have money to pay nurses a pay rise. We don't have money to pay teachers a pay rise. And people are getting pissed off with it. And they're asking, who are we fighting this war for? Why are people uninterested in peace? And I think that that's connected to what people have learned about the war, the revelations about the Nord Stream pipelines being blown up by Seymour Hersh's investigation that has suggested that the United States was responsible for that. Even the Israeli Prime Minister, or former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, giving an interview in which he revealed that they were very close to a peace deal in the early weeks of the war, that Turkey had negotiated terms that Ukraine and Russia were prepared to consider, and that the United States and Britain came in and said to the Ukrainians, do not consider this. So I think that realization is coming. I think it's coming faster in Germany, where for historical reasons, the idea of being dragged into war with Russia is obviously nightmarish, particularly nightmarish for Germany. I do think we shouldn't exaggerate where we are. Certainly in Britain, the march, we've also been commemorating at the Morning Star the fact that it's the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War, and the largest protest in British history was 20 years ago last month. I was on that demo. There were 2 million people on that demo. the march that we had last Saturday was tiny by comparison, and there were some hostile reactions from the public who were, accusing us of supporting Putin and what they call the genocidal war and so on. So there's a lot of work to be done because of the role of the media and certainly politicians in Britain in trying to shut down any rational discussion of the longer term causes of this conflict, and daily propaganda. We've got obviously about 40 different conflicts going on in the world at the moment, but what people see on their screens is death and destruction in Ukraine every day. And while that death and suffering in Ukraine is certainly very real, it's not given the same treatment. You've just had an item on Palestine. The Yemen war is still continuing. There are other conflicts continuing around the world, and they're not given that attention. So people are kind of primed to see Russia as the huge world problem right now. And it's a real democratic problem in Britain as well. I know I'm talking a lot, so if you want to cut in with any further questions, do. But
well, I am curious. You mentioned the issue of like the Nord Stream 2 explosion that Seymour Hersh had the bombshell report about. I'm just curious what the media landscape is like where you are, because obviously in the US, it's very much, one-sided to the point of you don't hear anything but the narrative. I mean, the only debate is how much more weapons should we be giving to Ukraine? How much more money should we be giving to Ukraine? The media in the US hasn't even bothered to cover Seymour Hersh's latest article about Nord Stream 2 being sabotaged by the United States. I'm curious if it's receiving more attention in the UK and Europe. And I'm wondering if that has in any way, the way that the war is being covered, if that in any way has contributed to the fact that you do have bigger protests in those places than I see in the US, at least so far.
Well, I think in Germany it's received a bit more attention because, of course, it was a pipeline to Germany, and the German public will be far better informed than others about the fact that the United States has been lobbying against this pipeline for years and years and trying every trick in the book to block it. And that President Biden actually said, if there is a war in Ukraine, then we will stop the Nord Stream pipeline. So there's more of a kind of priming of the public, I think, to understand the motives for the explosions. In Britain, there hasn't been very much coverage. There were a few headlines on the immediate day that the investigation was released. But again, although Seymour Hersh is one of the most prestigious journalists in the world, really, given the things that he's exposed in the past, most obviously the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, he's treated and referred to as some sort of oddball, crank journalist. There's that impression that it's not a serious investigation. It's this guy with an axe to grind against the United States. So you really have a media landscape so conformist that even the utterly illogical position that Russia has for some reason blown up its own pipeline is treated as more reasonable in our mainstream media than Seymour Hersh's allegations, which make a lot more sense. And I think there are other reasons for that. I mean, we've just lived through in Britain, before the pandemic, of course, we had 5 years of a real socialist leading the opposition, and we saw an absolute concerted, right across the media, from the liberal media through to the right, a concerted character assassination of him day in, day out for 5 years, all sorts of disgusting smears and so on, to make sure that socialist movement was destroyed. And I think that, the political elite in this country are very worried by what happened, and they're reacting by shutting down any possibility of it happening again. That's why on almost the day the war started, there was a Stop the War coalition statement, which was signed by a dozen or so Labour MPs, which condemned the invasion by Russia, but it also called for peace talks, and it referred to the role of NATO in having provoked this conflict. And there was an immediate instruction from the leader of the Labour Party that if people did not remove their names from that document, they would be expelled from the party, which is much more authoritarian than Tony Blair was. There was a big rebellion against the Iraq War under Tony Blair. People were not thrown out of the Labour Party for joining that. I think there's a new intolerance for the peace movement, and that's because they've seen that actually it has a lot of public support. There's a lot of public skepticism about our leaders when they talk about why we need to go to war, why we need to spend money on arms. When Jeremy Corbyn, after the Manchester Arena bombing in 2017, were bombing by a Libyan radical who had actually been assisted by MI5 to go to Libya and fight against Colonel Gaddafi, and then assisted back into this country, and then he carried out that terrorist attack on a pop concert, killing 22 people. Now, the consensus was that, you know, when there's an attack like this, you all have to rally round and make patriotic noises. And Jeremy challenged that, and he said this atrocity is linked to British foreign policy. And then the right were astonished that opinion polls showed a majority of British people agreed with him. Most people can, you know, understand that logic when it's put to them, and that worries the elite. They don't want these voices in the media, and I think it's very frightening the extent to which one state-sponsored narrative is now completely dominant, apart from a few small outlets like the Morning Star, and completely dominant in Westminster, apart from a couple of MPs. At this protest last weekend, we would have expected, even recently, like when the withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021, about 15 Labour MPs joined a Stop the War rally, which was saying, you know, the problem isn't the withdrawal, the problem was that we attacked Afghanistan in the first place. But those MPs were not there last Saturday. There's been a complete suppression of that feeling, and the only MPs to address the crowds were Jeremy Corbyn himself and Claudia Webb, two MPs who've already had the Labour whip removed. So in a sense, they've got nothing to lose. I'm not denigrating their courage in appearing, but it's only the ones who have already been kicked out who are addressing these platforms. And I think it's really disappointing. I think even at the height of the Cold War, there were Labour MPs who were prepared to stand up and say, no, we don't agree with this demonisation of Russia, and we think that you have to stand up for peace. Because, you know, this hysteria, when you start to silence all of the critical or sceptical voices, you see us being dragged on a kind of war fever towards what could be a really devastating conflict for the entire world, if there is a direct war with Russia over Ukraine. And at the same time, of course, the related issue of Britain joining the US in various military maneuvers in the Far East against China, signing military deals with Japan and Australia and so on. So if there is a third world war against Russia and China, in the way that British politicians talk, the way that American generals are talking, suggests that they are thinking that this is a very realistic possibility, then that is a conflict that will wipe out hundreds of millions of lives, that could permanently poison huge parts of the planet, permanently end any hope of collective action on climate change or any of the huge problems that we need to resolve together. So I think it's really positive what we saw last week, but we've got a lot of work to do. Certainly I'm filled with admiration for the size of the protests in Germany. I hope in Britain we can build bigger protests like that to start saying, you know, no, we've got to pull back here.
No, I hope the same. And as Andrew Murray actually said in the demonstration in London, this is where the world is, from Brazil to China to India, Indonesia to all across Africa. So hopefully in the US and the UK, we can start to catch up here. But Ben Chacko, really appreciate you, as always, joining us, editor of the Morning Star. Hopefully everyone's checking out the Morning Star. Great working class paper out of the UK. Thanks for giving us some of your time, Ben.
Thanks very much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Rania, well, I have to say, you know, this is, you know, just, I mean, I am actually very encouraged by what we saw in Germany. And, you know, the thing I think that's encouraging to me, despite the size, is the fact that, you know, true progressive forces are stepping to the front to try to organize a pro-peace opposition. You know, before it's Viktor Orban and the French far right and, you know, Marjorie Taylor Greene in the US. I mean, these execrable figures who, you know, they're for wars in a lot of circumstances, just not this one, and seem to be, you know, using this to bolster their forces around a ton of just, you know, really, really bad policies. You know, as Marjorie Taylor Greene says, take the weapons from Ukraine and put them on the southern border. So don't kill any white people in Ukraine, but definitely make sure you mow down the Haitians.
Yeah, and I will add that she also would, I believe she's a part of the forces that want to go to war instead with a country called China. So it's not a matter of even, oh, we want to prevent some big world war. It's just we're doing it against the wrong country. And I feel like it's a good moment to plug an interview that we posted this morning, that if you haven't had a chance to watch it, mark it or go watch it after this episode of The Freedom Side. We got a chance to speak to the legendary Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Seymour Hersh, who wrote the big article a few weeks ago laying out how the U.S. government under the Biden administration's orders blew up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline to try to not just cut Western Europe off from their ties with Russia, but also force them to stay involved in a war that really is against their own interests. This is such a big deal because it means that the U.S. basically committed an act of war against its, I think, most important ally in Europe. So it is interesting to see the very muted response from the Europeans so far, because at least privately, they must be having conversations like, what did this mad dog of a country, America, do? Because Europe isn't exactly the most sovereign place. It actually doesn't really have its own independent foreign policy, and that's why it's been forced into this really it's a war that doesn't benefit Europe at all. It benefits America. It actually really, it destroys European industry. It destroys the European economy. You've done so many episodes on the socialist program really laying that out. But anyways, very important interview with a very legendary, courageous investigative journalist who has been completely ostracized from the mainstream. So I highly recommend people go check it out.
I do too, and shout out to Hussein, James, and David who have made some donations here in the course of the show. Hussein, come with the Reals. All right, Brazil, come through. I had the great opportunity to speak on the panel with Douglas Belshore yesterday from Brazil, but another topic for another time. Now we want to turn to Jackson, Mississippi, where I don't know what else to call it, but a legislative coup is happening against the black population there in Jackson. And we are very, very honored to be joined for this conversation by Danielle Holmes, who's a national social justice organizer with the Poor People's Campaign and a resident of Jackson, Mississippi. Danielle, thank you so much for being back with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here with you all, although under horrible circumstances that I'm here today. But I will say that I'm here at the Capitol. That's why I'm not in front of my computer, because we've been seeing where games have been played on the Senate side with actually bringing the bill that they put on the calendar daily to the floor for debate, right? And so we've had folks flooded in the Senate gallery. Here at the state capitol, we're still waiting on the fate of that bill as it's set to go back on the Senate floor for debate, and then it will go back to the House. We see this as a complete, as you say, coup. Some have likened this to apartheid. Some have likened this to the Jim Crow era, the 1868, 1869. But we're really seeing here in Jackson, Mississippi, it's the most racist piece of legislation that I have ever seen come through since I've been. And Tuesday, I turned 49 years old. And so whenever there is power amongst Black power or Black leadership in elected in cities in the state of Mississippi, they go neglected, right? There's data to show that, there's a track record to show. This government, Jackson is so bad that says Jackson is so bad that it wants to step in. We've seen the takeover happen with our airport. We've seen the takeover, attempt to take over with the airport, which is, by the way, still in litigation in court. We've seen the attempt to take over our school districts, our water, and now there's an attempt to take over our police department. And it was an attempt to build a wealthy city, inside of the blackest city, one of the blackest cities in this country. It is an utterly disgrace that daily, this most Black populated city, we have to wake up daily with insults, racist insults from conservative leadership here in the state of Mississippi. of our incompetency, of our will to not want better. When the record shows that Jackson has asked for help as our population has declined, as we have experienced white flight, we've asked for help around the water, around public safety issues, and we've been denied that help. But nevertheless, even when we were denied help from our state government, we were so self-determined that we went out and got help for ourselves. And so we went out and got dollars to help when there was a water crisis to ensure that all Jacksonians had access to clean drinking water. Our government didn't do that. Community did that. We have community programs in place such as violence interrupters, credible messengers, that are community organizations that step in to de-escalate violence in our communities. This is all happening. Our government, state government, refuses to listen, refuses to hear the voices of those here in the state of Mississippi and in the city of Jackson. The only money there's in 2017, there was a referendum that was voted on for 1% sales tax by the citizens of Jackson. We voted to raise our own tax dollars to pay for our own infrastructure. We voted to pave the roads. We voted to fix the pipes. This legislative session, our state legislators went in and amended the voices of the people and said that the 1% sales tax money that the citizens of Jackson voted to increase, they can no longer use that money to pave roads, but that money must only go to water, fixing the water and sewer infrastructure. Well, if anyone knows, it takes money to break up the roads to even get to the pipes. So once the roads are broken up to go and fix the pipes, legislation is in there where money cannot be allocated to repave those roads. This is horrendous what's going on. There have been at least 8 or 9 bills that have come out against the city of Jackson alone. No other municipality but the city of Jackson. This is a targeted attempt and a targeted attack on the 84% population, Black population in the city of Jackson, and this Black-led administration. And what we do know that if it happens to Jackson, we've seen legislation recently that we just was notified that it will also affect Hattiesburg and Meridian. So when they come after Jackson, we want people to know that they will come after the next municipality. If it can happen in Jackson, which is now happening in Buckhead, Atlanta, Georgia, is now happening in St. Louis, Missouri, where the House has already passed to give the state takeover over the prosecutor because there's a Black prosecutor that has been targeted there by the state. This will be.
Oh, we might have lost Danielle.
That's unfortunate, and that's crazy what's happening.
So we have to step our game up.
There we go.
It's time that we step our game up. We can no longer sleep during the summer months. Conservatives, Republicans, or whatever you want to call them, they're meeting around the clock. And they're getting their business together while we are out vacationing, living our best lives. And when we come back to the and during the legislative session, this is what we're faced with because we're not ready. We're unprepared. Our legislators are not ready to take on. And so what we must begin to build now towards having that great majority, right? We know that we don't have the majority, but at what point do we start building towards that majority? We have to do our work. We can't continue to talk about what the white man is doing to us if we're not willing to get up and do our own work and to fight these attacks. This is an attack that should not have ever gotten out of control. And so we must hold our own Hinds County legislators accountable as well. Some have been complicit. They've been blasted by the state chairs on the House and the Senate side of meeting around this takeover for the last 2.5 years, while telling their constituents that they knew nothing about it. And so again, we can't call out one without really digging deep and driving in and calling out those that were complicit in this takeover and this attack on the city of Jackson. Thanks.
No, thank you, Danielle. I really appreciate that. I mean, it's amazing to create a special police district with people coming from outside. And that's one of the things I wanted to ask you about, too, because I'm really glad you brought up the issue of violence interrupters and credible messengers, because, I mean, it seems like to me, so much of the discourse that we have been having in Black communities across the country has been, we can address violence without having police brutality. But it seems to me that this is likely to erase all of that, at least in the areas where these special police are able to operate, and they're just gonna come in with the same old style of policing that, you know, we've been up in arms against since the 1930s. And it just really does feel like the level of violence being used here. Like, now I think some people have seen the story and it just seems like a legislative thing, but the level of violence being imposed on the Black community there in Jackson feels like such a big part of this to me.
Absolutely. But see, one of the problems is that when you don't talk about the issues, the root problems, Mississippi in 2016, I believe, passed the 2015 or 2016, passed the open carry law, right? Which gave rights to young Black males to carry guns across their bodies as if it was a part of their outfits, right? This is problematic. One problem is that you already underfund education. So you're not fully educating our community, right? And so when there's a lack of education, there's a lack of really knowing how to decipher what's wrong and what's right and what's wrong, because you haven't been educated. But to have this bill that says that you can go and purchase an assault rifle as long as you're not a convicted felon, you don't have to have a permit, and then to have a U.S. senator to even propose being able to get an assault rifle, obtain an assault rifle at the age of 18, and that was done by U.S. Senator Cindy Hyde Smith. Right? This just goes to show that this is all a setup for the Black community's demise. And to continue to push that narrative and not want to talk about gun control, not wiping away Second Amendment rights, right? Because we believe that you should have a right to bear arms. But you should not have a right to be able to walk around free will with assault rifles while police officers are armed with Glocks, 9mm. But then you want to talk about gun violence. You perpetuate this bad behavior, but then you want to punish it as well. And it's constantly being overlooked. But many elected officials refuse to talk about anything dealing with firearms because many of them get campaign donations from the National Rifle Association. And so we have to be very clear as to why so many are afraid to take on this issue.
You know, I'm just curious for those who are watching and are as horrified as we all are by what's taking place in Mississippi. I mean, first of all, do you think that the stakes here could possibly be something that other states might be watching for to replicate if it does work? And then
we're already getting calls. We're getting calls that this is an attempt that is happening right now in St. Louis, right? It was happening in St. Louis when it was happening in Mississippi. But Mississippi thought that we were the only state that it was happening to. So we know that it's happening in, I believe I heard yesterday, Alabama. We know that it's happening in Buckhead and Atlanta, right? In Georgia. So this is just the beginning of what's to come across the states, across this country. And if our president now doesn't step in Because this bill, this kind of legislation ultimately leads to stripping the power of voting away from residents in these states. It was an attempt to appoint prosecutors, judges, circuit clerks, chancery clerks here in Jackson, Mississippi. The Jackson Undivided Coalition, we fought hard. We fought loud. We knew that it was unconstitutional. We were ready to go to court. We threatened to go to court. Legislators wanted this bill passed so badly, they began to strip parts of it out. And the parts that they knew were definitely unconstitutional, they stripped that piece away. But the audacity to even attempt to take away the rights of voters, judges, to put our lives in the hands of elected and appointed judges were very dangerous to the country.
I think we might have lost Danielle there.
I will repeat myself. The legislation that they have tried to push forward will not only strip away the voting power from the residents here in the city of Jackson, but will be very detrimental to the democracy, our democracy across this country.
Mm-hmm. I think that is 100% true. And before we let you go, Danielle, is there a way people watching around the country who want to support you all can do so?
Yes, you can go to the Jackson, JXN, www.jxn, peoples, with an S, assembly.org. Sign the petition to stop the Capitol Police takeover of the city of Jackson. Sign the petition to stop the takeover of Jackson's water, regionalizing Jackson's water system as well. And continue to lift up this story across the country of what's not only what's happening in Jackson, but what's happening in Missouri, what's happening in Georgia, and what's happening all across this country as it relates to voter suppression and this kind of racist legislation that must be stopped. And the refusal to allow anyone to take us back to an era of Jim Crow or slavery. Mm-hmm. We must call on the nation to march on every state that think that they will do this and get away with it.
Danielle Holmes, Jackson, Mississippi resident, and with the Poor People's Campaign, thank you one more time for giving us some of your time on the freedom side.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Unbelievable situation there. So-called special police district being attempting to be set up there by the state of Mississippi in Jackson. So basically all white conservative legislatures will appoint cops that they like to police the all black city, or at least large parts of it, of Jackson, Mississippi. That is certainly much more progressive in terms of its policies. So clear ideological and racial implications there. Hopefully people can check that out at jacksonpeoplesassembly.org, as you see on the bottom of the screen. Amazing work being done there to fight back. And there's, as Danielle mentioned, multiple other takeovers of the water district, of things that have already happened, the airports and others, but please check that out. Well, we want to turn our attention now to South Dakota and to one of the important anniversaries in terms of the rights of indigenous people here in this country, and that is the Wounded Knee uprising that took place 50 years ago there. And we are very honored to be joined here by Jean Roach, who's a Minikozu Lakota and also the co-director of the International Leonard Peltier Defense Committee with AIM Grassroots, and also a survivor of the shootout in Ogallala in South Dakota in 1975. Jean, thanks so much for being back with us. Oh, she might be frozen.
We'll get that fixed.
We will.
We always do.
But yeah, no, to swing back around to the issue of Jackson, I mean, it really is amazing, quite frankly, when you go back and you look at the history of it, that, you know, they're always saying that there's no money from the state of Mississippi to help Jackson. They, you know, they say we need more money from the state, as you know, our previous guests had laid out, you know, the issues of white flight, the erosion of the tax base, the fact that a lot of the folks who live there are poor working class folks. And the legislature in Mississippi, you know, always says that there's no money, that they're not going to give it, that, you know, you can't trust these people. And I think the racist undertones of that are clear. And then when a crisis happens, like what we saw with the water crisis, they then are using this as an opportunity to come in and take over the sovereign rights of the city. I think it's important to remember what's happened, you know, since about, it was 2015, but it might have been 2017. You know, we've had two separate father-son mayors, Chokwe Antar Lumumba, his son. Obviously, the elder Chokwe Lumumba is a well-known radical figure in the Black liberation movement in America. It was a huge thing for him to become the mayor of Jackson. His son has become the mayor. So there's been a lot of huge progressive changes there, and we've seen the aggressive attacks at every single turn and no assistance. Really a terrible thing. But I think we have Gene Roach back with us as we talk about Wounded Knee. Gene, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I hope I don't lose you guys. Yeah, that was a couple days ago. Was the 50th anniversary of the 1975 Wounded Knee takeover or occupation. A lot of the concerns that we had back in 1973 are still valid today. We face the same racism and the unfair justice system that puts our people in prison still to date. I represent Leonard Peltier, who's been in there on 48 years now. He was not at Wounded Knee, but a lot of the era of the reign of terror then stories start to genocide in 1890 with the massacre at Wounded Knee.
Don't know if maybe we lost Gene there.
Can you hear us?
Oh, maybe getting
gremlins.
Camera fix. I know she's out there now. The big commemoration that took place this Monday out there. A large number of folks came from all around the country, probably all around the world, to commemorate what took place there at Wounded Knee, and you know what originally took place there, of course, in 1890, the brutal massacre of the indigenous people, and then of course the uprising there, the 70s of indigenous people defending their own rights. An amazing, really amazing set of circumstances, quite frankly, and something that's deeply unknown, I think, in the history. And we know Leonard Peltier, who, you know, is continuing to be held, I think, after Mumia Abu-Jamal, or maybe right up there with him. I think actually Leonard might have been in there a few more years, one of the longest held political prisoners in America. It's basically, framed up in a complete and total railroad chart. It's unbelievable when you go back and read the history. I have to encourage people to read the history because there were two other individuals who were in another trial just before Leonard, and they actually were completely let go. And so the federal government, you know, they have this, they move the trial, they get to an all-white jury, you know, they change things around, they're using all sorts of very dodgy, you know, information that was clearly falsified or coerced at the time, all these different things, and then they just convict Leonard. So, I mean, it's the exact same trial, exact same situation, and they just engineered it in such a way to make sure that Leonard Peltier would be railroaded here for the alleged killing of two FBI officials. And we say alleged because there's literally no proof that he was the one who did it, and a lot of questions about, you know, what they were even doing there in the first place, and, you know, the reign of terror against indigenous activists at that time. And I think when we think about Wounded Knee, 50 years on, in the middle of the 1970s, it's something that a lot of people probably don't know a lot about. But in the same time, a lot of us think and talk about, the issues of the Black Panthers and the late civil rights movement and the Chicano rights movement and all these different pieces. Native Americans were also rising up in a huge way. And, you know, this big march, the Trail of Tears event in 1970, I think it was, 1971. They take over the Bureau Indian affairs, and it really kicks off this huge new movement all across the reservations in this country. There's a huge movement by indigenous activists to take power, to take control of the tribal administrations, to bring in traditional indigenous practices that had been totally marginalized, by these genocidal officials from the United States government who didn't want indigenous people to practice their own history and culture. And there's a reign of terror, and they get these people in Pine Ridge, where this is happening. They actually called them the goons, these natives who were working with the administration, and they're using all sorts of beatings, shootings, killings. They're monopolizing the money that's coming from the federal government to give people sweetheart jobs and to make sure that anyone pushing the rights of indigenous people is poor and marginalized, doesn't have access to good land on the reservation. And it was called the Reign of Terror. It was the Reign of Terror. I mean, it really was. If you were standing up with the American Indian movement and AIM, the possibility of just being killed and assassinated was very, very high. The government of the United States did not care at all. They also wanted these people dead. And at Wounded Knee, after a number of different incidents, a number of folks from AIM decided to stand up and defend themselves against this horrendous attack and reign of terror. They stood their ground, for several weeks against the full force of the U.S. government. The FBI had military type units out there and different things like that. And it really electrified for the country these issues that were facing Native Americans. And unfortunately, the legal assault only intensified after that in an attempt to cripple AIM. And all of the major leaders were, either driven out of the country, driven into prison, and so many others, Dennis Banks and so on and so forth, the late Dennis Banks. And, anyway, Jean Roach, one of those people, she's out there in Pine Ridge, and I think probably had some connectivity issues, but as a young person was a part of the Ogallala shootout, survivor of that, and Leonard Peltier, who she is one of the great advocates of, continuing to be incarcerated in federal prison, falsely railroaded in an extraordinarily racist trial that was done specifically to try to take him out because he was one of the main figures in AIM that was helping protect those who are performing the traditional rites in these various reservations who are being attacked by these agents of the U.S. government. So an amazing story, an amazing history, and hats off. And we were there, breakthrough news at the commemoration of Wounded Knee that took place earlier this week, and we will have more coverage coming for you from that, including from Jean Roach. So hopefully everyone out and check out some of this history, Rania. There's a lot of things that are written about it. There's a pretty good book actually called In the Spirit of Crazy Horse by Peter Mathiasen, who people who want to look into it. I will say he has kind of a dodgy history and reputation. Some people say he was a CIA agent. There's different elements to that.
Oh no.
He very much says that's not true. Here's what I'll say about that. I'm not going to say whether he is or is not. But the book itself is a pretty good corroboration and layout of what took place over this whole period, and a very, very good explanation of the railroading of Leonard Peltier and how just unbelievable it was. And I think, a lot of the voices of AIM are also carried in that book, and I think the bravery and the spirit that they brought to that struggle and still bring to us today really deserves to be heard and deserves to be seen. And there's a lot of other pieces. Dennis Banks' memoir also touches on this. Leonard Peltier also has written a book. So there's a lot that's out there, about this, but, hopefully folks can check it out and see it, because it really is, an amazing history, and one that's being continued by a new generation of natives in this country, in the struggle to do something about climate change and climate access. And, shout out to those native folks there in Little Earth in Minneapolis, who I know are continuing to struggle today over the rights to lands and this ridiculous plan they have to tear down community garden and put something ridiculous up there, some warehouse or something. So also try to continue to cover that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also important, and I think back to being in school, and I think Wounded Knee is one of those things where it gets like a sort of footnote kind of mention, like, oh, this thing happened once, the name, like you've heard Wounded Knee, you don't quite know what it is or the extent of it. I mean, just like everything when it comes to the history of the treatment of Native Americans in the United States, and like the crimes that have been committed since before the U.S. was founded by European colonialism on this continent to now. And so it's really incredible that it's like something that you can only go learn about in alternative media. And hopefully you just caught Eugene Puryear mentioning, because a few books you can read to like learn the details, because you're definitely not going to see it in the mainstream media. You're definitely, not going to see a bunch of different documentaries on it in places that are easily accessible. So there you have it.
Yes, indeed. Well, we want to get ready to turn to our next story here, which is about the relationship of, so-called junk fees to mass incarceration. And we just want to play a clip for you here from the State of the Union because President Biden really brought this issue of junk fees in a big way back into the political discourse. And we thought, since it's been a few weeks since the State of the Union, we'd remind you of that before getting into the mass incarceration element of it.
My administration is also taking on junk fees, those hidden surcharges too many companies use to make you pay more. For example, we're making airlines show you the full ticket price up front, refund your money if your flight is canceled or delayed. We've reduced exorbitant bank overdrafts by saving consumers more than $1 billion a year. We're cutting credit card late fees by 75% from $30 to $8. Look, junk fees may not matter to the very wealthy, but they matter to most other folks in homes like the one I grew up in, like many of you did. They add up to hundreds of dollars a month. They make it harder for you to pay your bills or afford that family trip. I know how unfair it feels when a company overcharges you and gets away with it. Not anymore. We've written a bill to stop it all. It's called the Junk Fee Prevention Act. We're going to ban surprise resort fees that hotels charge on your bill. Those fees can cost you up to $90 a night at hotels that aren't even resorts.
It was certainly, I think we all know about these junk fees, and we are very happy to be joined as we continue the show by Caroline Cohn, who's an attorney and Equal Justice Works Fellow at the National Consumer Law Center. Caroline, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me and for bringing attention to this issue.
Well, it's a crucial issue. It's certainly one that I was happy to hear the president talk about. I think we've all felt it in our pocketbook. But, one element of the junk fees that is not really being addressed as of yet, it seems in a major way, correct me if I'm wrong, in front of the legislature, is those junk fees connected to mass incarceration and the incarcerated people in this country. So maybe just to start, give us a sense of what those who are incarcerated are sort of put upon them and their families as it concerns these fees.
Yeah, absolutely. You are correct that this has not made it into Biden's speeches or into the spotlight much at all. My organization and 28 other organizations submitted comments to the Federal Trade Commission about junk fees affecting justice-involved people. And the things we're talking about here are, being gouged to send money to your family member, being gouged with fees when you are just trying to access your own money when you're released from prison, which might be money that you had when you were arrested or money that you accrued while you were inside. And then just to be able to get access to your own money again, you get a debit card instead of a cash or check, and that debit card charges you fees for using the card or not using the card or making a purchase and having it declined. All these ways to gouge consumers in this space. Emails are another one. They're free on the outside. They're about 50 cents per email for no reason on the inside. Tablets are another source of fee harvesting for these private companies. So those are the sorts of fees that incarcerated folks and their families are up against.
I have an extended family member who is in prison, and his family goes crazy because it's crazy when you think about like the fact that you're given in prison the cheapest of cheapest products to wash your body with, to brush your teeth with. And if you want something that isn't going to give you a rash or isn't going to make you sick, you have to have a family that's going to be able to put money into purchasing all of these kinds of things. And the price gouging is insane. And the amount of money that his family just ends up spending for him to have access to like super basic things that you and I can go easily purchase at like Walmart or CVS or wherever is just unbelievable. But I just wasn't aware of this debit card issue that like when you get out, can you talk a little bit about about what exactly that is. I had no idea this even existed. What exactly that is and how it can lead to you being charged with the little amount that you have left, if you're lucky enough, I guess, to even have any money left when you get out.
Yes, and I'd actually like to touch on the first string of things you mentioned, just how expensive it is to be in prison or jail, which I think a lot of people who are lucky enough to not have a loved one who's incarcerated think that it's free once you're in prison or jail. And that was true a while ago, maybe, but not anymore. Private companies have absolutely pervaded prisons and jails, and it is extremely expensive. You have to buy stamps, your own paper, tampons and pads, over-the-counter meds, medical copays. So I just want to reiterate what you said and say that's absolutely right. And I think that's a common misconception. And, that was one fee that we raised too, is family members have to send money in so that their loved ones can pay for these things. And the fees for sending money in will be, the average fee is 20%. Compare that to Venmo or Zelle, it's free, or maybe, around 3% if if there's a credit or debit card involved, but there's no reason it needs to be 20%. That's not the actual cost of these transfers. But then to go to your other question about release cards, I also did not know that was a thing before working on policy in this space. And it used to be the case that prisons and jails would give people their money on a check or via cash. And then private equity got involved and said, why don't we use these release cards, these prepaid debit cards, which could be more convenient for folks, but not in the way that they're currently used. They're extremely laden with fees. And, I mentioned closing an account. I think one company charges $10 just to close your account. So do you even have $10 left on your card at that point? And this is to access your own money. Or making a purchase. If you go to CVS and buy something with your credit card, you don't have to pay the fee for that transaction because CVS pays your bank. And that's true for these prepaid debit cards too. The debit card company is paying the bank, is being paid by the merchant, but they're charging the recently released person too. So they're just double collecting there. So it's really just a way of price gouging because they can and because people don't have another choice.
One of the things about this that just strikes me as so incredibly predatory is, the importance of many of these services, especially staying connected to people on the outside, staying connected to life on the outside. I mean, the way tablets, for instance, are promoted, and correctly so, is, recidivism is always reduced when you have more connection to people and more connection to the world. So, the way they'll say, oh, we're providing tablets to people for music, for video services. But it seems that some of these companies, especially, are providing services for significantly higher prices than what the same service would cost on the outside. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So these tablets are often touted as free, and sometimes the tablet themselves is free, but then the costs of the things that you can do on the tablet are extremely expensive. So, a Spotify account might be $10 a month for your family. It's $15 for 2 weeks if you're incarcerated. Emails are also sent via tablets, and those are 50 cents. They're free on the outside, and staying in touch with loved ones is extremely important, also for recidivism and successful reentry. And the company JPay is one of the big tablet providers, and they say, this is cheaper than a postage stamp. But there's no reason to compare the cost to a postage stamp. Postage stamps have to be, it's the law that they have to be set at a rate that compensates the postal service for how much it costs to actually process mail. But it does not cost 50 cents to process an email. And they also have character limits on these emails often. Different companies will. So you'll have to send multiple emails. But again, we have the technology. The technology is there, and they're just finding ways to make it more expensive. Oh, and a couple
Let
more
me
egregious.
go ahead.
Oh,
go ahead.
I'm sorry. Just
No,
very
please. I want to hear the
egregious-
couple more. Yeah.
Thank you. On the tablets is in Pennsylvania, they ended book donations in favor of expensive ebooks, and they took a lot of those ebooks from a free online library. Another example, a Florida jail, took away Bibles, and folks have to get e-Bibles on tablets. So it is. You can't make it up. It's really outrageous, and it's almost laughable, but it's so tragic that it's a really bad situation.
I was going to ask you, who are the companies that are profiting off of this? Are they companies specifically set up just to sell these particular products at these insanely high prices in jails, in prisons, or are there banks profiting? I mean, usually there's like already really big companies that are getting in on the profit here. So I'm just curious, who is profiting off of this?
That's an excellent question. It's really come down to it's an oligopoly. There's very few players who are in this space now. Securus, if you have a loved one in prison, you've probably heard of Securus because they're a major telecom provider. And the other one is used to be called Global Tel-Link or GTL. Now it's ViaPath. Those were the two major phone companies. They cover about 60% of people who are incarcerated, their phone calls. And phone calls have become increasingly regulated, which is great, and they need to be more regulated or become free. That's what we're pushing. But as this space has become more regulated, those telecoms companies have evolved to evade regulation by buying up tons of competitors, and basically, now JPay and Securus are part of the same parent, owned by the same parent company, and they cover phone calls and tablets and emails and debit release cards. And it's really this oligopoly, like I said. So it's companies that specialize in the correctional macro economy. And to your question about whether banks are getting in on this, that's a great question. My guess is yes, but I don't actually know the answer to that.
Well, it'll be interesting, something maybe for us to do a little research on the journalism side, because for sure, I mean, it feels like such a hamster wheel. I remember when the prison phone calls issue was so huge, and then they told everyone it was solved, and here we still are. But talk about the campaign that you all are waging at the National Consumer Law Center with a very big coalition, because at least seems like the junk fee issue overall is getting some traction. So perhaps it's a propitious moment here for this issue as well.
Yes, that's what we're hoping for. And the Biden administration has, made a lot of their racial equity goals, and they say that they're very focused on justice-involved individuals across different agencies. So there was this proposed rulemaking, and I can back up because I didn't know what any of this meant before I was in this space or went to law school. Basically, executive agencies, before they can make a rule in their space, so executive agencies are like the Environmental Protection Agency, the Consumer Financial Protection Agency, the Federal Trade Commission is the one we submitted comments to in this case. Before they make a rule to regulate an industry, for example, they have to put out a proposed rule and accept comments from the public on that rule and have to consider those. So that's what happened with the Federal Trade Commission. We submitted these comments about they did a proposed rulemaking on addressing junk fees, and we said, hey, we love that you want to address junk fees, but you really can't overlook incarcerated people and their loved ones when you're doing this. They're an extremely vulnerable population who are extremely harmed by these fees. So we're urging the Federal Trade Commission to look into this, the CFPB as well, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Different actions they can take are taking enforcement actions. If there's a particularly egregious actor, the CFPB actually already took some action against JPay for their conduct in the debit release space. And, that's what we're doing at the federal level. in addition to other advocacy, we're also doing things at the state level as well, supporting efforts to make prison phone calls free, because as you rightly point out, that issue is not over. So Massachusetts has some bills that were recently introduced to make prison and jail phone calls free there. So we're trying to capitalize on the momentum and push wherever we can gain some ground.
And for like regular people who aren't involved in any particular advocacy role but are outraged by this, or people who maybe have family members who are incarcerated, who are like, just have had it up to here with all this stuff, like what are ways that they can get involved in pushing for policy changes?
That's a great question. A couple of the organizations that we partnered with on these comments, one is Worth Rises. They have a great website showing all the different campaigns in different states and localities where free phone calls are being pushed. And I know that, it's an emotional toll, obviously, but to the extent people can testify about how these things affect them and their families, that's always extremely powerful. Our organization and the other organizations who signed on to the comment are often also funded by donations. So if people can spare money, the lobbyists on the other side are very well funded, but it's kind of these nonprofits who are fighting on this side. And just like you guys are doing, continuing to keep the spotlight on this issue, and like your viewers are doing, staying informed, because I think a lot of this goes very much under the radar, and that's on purpose.
Caroline Cohn, Equal Justice Works Fellow at the National Consumer Law Center. We really appreciate you taking some of your time to help us explain all this here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much for having me.
Mm-hmm. No, it's unbelievable issue on so many different levels. But I mean, look, this is obviously morally wrong in every possible way. I think people can see that. But I think one thing that's important for people to understand here, these are not just like random things. For people who claim to care about public safety, literally the number one factor in whether or not reentry can be successful is how connected people are able to remain to their friends, to their family, and to their community. Because that's what allows you to set up a plan to get back in, to get a job, to have a place to stay. All the things that if you don't have make your life extremely precarious and unstable, and often ends up in most people returning to prison. And when you really look at it, even most people convicted of quote unquote violent crimes, when they do go back, it's almost never for anything that's quote unquote a violent crime, but it's almost always for crimes of survival, because they don't have the ability and the means to survive because there's so much discrimination in the job market. And so the closer you can be connected to your friends, your family, your community, what's going on. I mean, people have really no concept, I think, sometimes. I mean, I've met many people over the years who went into prison on these long, lengthy sentences because of the war on drugs and, the so-called tough on crime policies that had gone in before the internet existed. And so then they come out of prison and they don't even know how to look for a job, to use a cell phone, to operate a tablet, to get on the internet. And so they are essentially helpless. So the ability to be able to know what's going on, to have, to be in touch with just the everyday life and reality, people might say, oh, Spotify, that seems like some sort of thing. Honestly, like just knowing what's going on is absolutely critical in being able to navigate the world when you come out in such a way that you can actually reestablish your life. So this is very important. It's not just an issue of people being overcharged for things they don't need or whatever. And I think I just wanted to stress that, not necessarily that our audience needs to know that, but perhaps for those who who might push back on you when you try to tell them these stories.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. It's really outrageous. And, if you have anybody you love who's in that situation, it gets even worse too, because there's also some people, I mean, we're talking about junk fees, but there's also medicine, the issue of medicine. There's people who need medication for bipolar disorder or things like this. And sometimes they can't get it because of the bureaucracy they have inside. And then I've known of families who have to smuggle basic antipsychotic medication inside of prisons, because there's all kinds of smuggling that takes place inside prisons, and who's not too is prison guards. The point is, sometimes people have to smuggle things into their family members, to their loved ones, because they can't get what they need on the inside because of the layers of bureaucracy and just price gouging that exists. For that, there's a whole other underground industry inside prisons and jails that prison guards are involved in that they profit off of. I mean, there's also like bartering and trading that prison guards get involved in too, when it comes to just basic things like cigarettes. So there's like every layer, there's just so much abuse in the prison system that affects all these people who are inside, who have like zero rights, and so few people, if anybody, advocating for them, except for some organizations like the woman from the organization we just interviewed. But like, it's great that those organizations exist, because when it comes to people on the inside, like literally they have no voice.
That's true, except for us. So speak up if you can. But that will bring us to the end of the show this week. It's less actually sad for me than it normally is, Rania, since you're actually here with us in New York.
Yeah, because I'm still here afterwards.
Very sad for our audience that we'll have to miss you for yet another week, but we will be back. But another good reminder, of course, definitely hit subscribe so that you can subscribe to everything. Hit the bell so that you get the alerts, so that everything you're subscribed to comes directly to you, like Dispatches with Rania Khalek, which you should definitely check out right now today. As soon as this show is over, go all to videos on our YouTube page and check out our excellent interview with Seymour Hersh about his recent expose as it concerns the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And don't forget, you can go to patreon.com/breakthrough news. That's patreon.com/breakthrough news. You can become a patron. And what else, Rania? Jesus.
And if we can get 100 patrons, you guys, in the month of March, I know we can do it, 100 new patrons, then Eugene Puryear will join Instagram. He has to. He has no choice. He's contractually obligated. So become a patron at patreon.com/breakthrough news for as little as like a few dollars a month. And you can help support this show, help get Eugene on Instagram, and make me happy, because I really want Eugene to be on Instagram. So there you have it.
Right on. Well, as always, Rania, it's a pleasure to be here alongside of you. Thanks to everybody who donated today, everyone who watched, everyone who will watch, the whole Breakthrough News team that makes this show possible. And we will see you next week.
Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.